there can be no conquest to the man who dwells in the narrow and small environment of a groveling life, and there can be no vision to the man the horizon of whose vision is limited by the bounds of self. But the great things of the world, the great accomplishments of the world, have been achieved by men who had high ideals and who have received great visions. The path is not easy. The climbing is rugged and hard, but the glory at the end is worthwhile. Matthew Henson, First Mate. Through their willingness to break cultural, strategic, and physical barriers, the members of Robert Peary's 3 attempted expeditions to the North Pole set groundbreaking precedents in the history of scientific exploration. The world's largest deserts are the 2 polar landmasses, Antarctica and the Arctic. Despite the abundance of ice, water, and by extension, plant and animal life are painfully rare in these regions. The Arctic's fringes have long been inhabited by the Inuit tribes, whose nomadic lifestyles, heat-efficient shelters and clothing, and sophisticated hunting, fishing, and transportation techniques enabled them to effectively adapt and persist for thousands of years. Yet for the entirety of its existence until the late 19th century, the vast interior of the Arctic remained largely unexplored by humanity. Adventurers such as Ernest Shackleton, Fridtjof Nansen, and John Franklin ventured further and further north in search of fortune and fame, paying for mistakes with the lives of their crew or themselves. Though Inuit mythology describes those unexplored Arctic lands as home to fantastic giants, dwarves, and nymphs, the American Admiral Robert Peary was a practical, clear-headed man whose Spartan worldview had little room for such intrigue. Since he was a young man working as a draftsman for the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in Washington, D.C., Peary desired to become the first man in recorded history to reach the North Pole. But his dream was one founded in lucid reality. To develop the survival skills and strong leadership capabilities necessary for a successful polar voyage, Peary spent time in the U.S. Navy as a civil engineer in environments ranging from Nicaragua to northern Greenland, testing his geographical knowledge and gaining experience working with tools, animals, and other people in unfamiliar territory. During this time, Peary also met 2 individuals who would later become vital to his exploration of the Arctic Circle. The first was Matthew Henson. Peary met him when Henson was still working as a store clerk in a clothing store. A brief conversation revealed him to be intelligent, physically adept young man with experience as a cabin boy. Peary promptly hired him as a personal valet and first mate, the beginning of a professional relationship that would continue for decades. The second was Josephine Dybish, the valedictorian of a graduating class of 1880 at the Spencerian Business College. Dybish bravely embodied a new model of femininity that dared to venture outside of the constraining domestic sphere and confront the challenges and opportunities of the world as a whole. Peary would eventually marry her in 1888. Her presence in his life was a vital linchpin bolstering his progress towards his goal. Peary's early expeditions to the Arctic were brief but educational experiences. Every near-death experience taught Peary the value of traveling with a trusted crew, carefully rationing food and supplies, and utilizing the environment effectively. In particular, after Peary broke his leg in a collision with the ship's iron tiller, he stayed in an area called Red Cliff for almost 6 months while he recovered. In this time, he became familiar with the terrain of the Arctic and the practices of the local Inuit people. Though a strong cultural barrier existed between Western explorers and the native people of the region, unlike other explorers of his time, Peary chose to adopt many Inuit practices that significantly enhanced the safety and efficiency of his journeys. For example, Peary learned to train and work with sled dogs proficiently, learning how to ensure they were well energized, disciplined, and motivated throughout a months-long expedition. Additionally, Peary began wearing his famous Inuit furs, which not only preserved warmth during daytime activity, but also removed the burden of carrying heavy sleeping bags for separate use at nighttime, when instead, he could wear his warm furs inside an igloo built according to traditional Inuit methods immediately when needed. Finally, Peary synthesized his knowledge of the military supply chain with indigenous Arctic survival techniques to develop the Peary system of support teams and supply caches distributed throughout the Arctic to offer safe areas for retreat and recuperation. After his leg recovered, Peary continued to embark on several expeditions between 1898 and 1902, to experiment with his new exploration practices and train for an attempt at the North Pole. In fact, during an early trip, his wife Josephine Diebisch even joined his team as a dietitian, despite her lack of formal training and experience. Though newspapers reviled Peary for allowing her to risk her life on such dangerous missions, they granted Diebisch grudging respect for being so daring and adaptive. After almost a decade, Peary had finally secured funding from several wealthy backers to buy a new ship and equipment via the newly formed Peary Arctic Club. In 1906, the Peary system was put to the test. A trial by fire. The SS Roosevelt successfully navigated the icy waters between Greenland and Ellesmere Island, becoming the first ship that had traveled so far in the Western Hemisphere during that era. Nevertheless, after a vicious ice storm separated the group into two halves, stuck on rapidly melting ice floes, Peary quickly traversed a dissolving path towards stable ground, saving his own life and the lives of those who followed him. By the time Peary had returned home from his second failed attempt, he was no longer a young man. Years of bitter Arctic gales and unrelenting sunbeams left his face creased and burnt. His aging body had become as lean and hard as his heart. On July 6, 1908, Peary embarked on his final trip. Years later, Captain Bartlett described the final moments before departure on the bluffs of Cape Columbia. Peary said little. I think he knew it was his last try. His first-hand experience derived from a lifetime of trial-and-error attempts at Arctic exploration had culminated in this ultimate attempt. Peary was fully prepared. His inventory totaled 124 men, 19 sledges, and 133 dogs. Once again, the SS Roosevelt carried her master and his crew through icy straits into the heart of the Arctic. Once again, his trusty sled dogs and their Inuit trainers cruised over black ice just a few inches thick towards 90 degrees north. The last support party turned back on April 1st. Finally, on April 6th, with only 5 of his most trusted assistants, his first mate Matthew Henson, and 4 experienced Inuit drivers named Uta, Igingwa, Siglo, and Ukwa, Peary drove for almost 2 days without pause until he reached the pole. At the pole, Henson recounted observing Peary reach into his furs, pull out the small, silk American flag sewn by Peary's wife Josephine in 1898 when they were first married, and plant it onto his igloo proudly. After making a few measurements to verify his position, Peary hastily jotted down in his notebook, "The pole at last, the prize of 3 centuries, my dream and goal for 20 years. Mine at last. I cannot bring myself to realize it. It all seems so simple and commonplace." Though disputes regarding the accuracy of Peary's measurements erupted in later years, a committee of the National Geographic Society as well as the Naval Affairs Subcommittee of the U.S. House of Representatives verified his findings and credited Peary with reaching the North Pole first. He had crossed the land without mercy and lived to tell the tale. Peary's journey to the pole broke barriers in 3 senses. First, by integrating Inuit survival techniques with Western logistics tactics, Peary shattered the cultural boundaries that had inhibited Arctic exploration in ages past, fusing the two methodologies to create a synergistic whole. Second, by traveling with a multiracial group that at one point even included a Western woman, Peary demonstrated his belief in genuine diversity and meritocracy. Traditional barriers based upon race or gender did not matter to him as much as raw performance and tenacity. Third and finally, by reaching the North Pole, Peary emerged victorious over a physical barrier that no one was able to surpass previously. He broke the literal barrier of the Arctic realm. Peary's expedition generated historical precedents that shaped the course of future Arctic exploration. By proving the efficacy of strategically distributed support teams and supply caches, the Peary system served as the basis for future ventures. Moreover, Peary's team established ties between Inuit tribes and the Western world that were utilized by later explorers such as Wally Herbert, a connection that proved invaluable to economic trade and the exchange of ideas. The Arctic's relevance is constantly increasing in the modern day, as both an area rich in research opportunities regarding unique species found nowhere else in the world, and a region with vast quantities of hidden natural resources such as minerals, oil, and natural gas. Peary's expedition helped pave the way for much of the further settlement and development of this biome. As a closing note, the crater located directly above the moon's north pole is named Peary's Crater, after him. They say to shoot for the moon so that even if you miss, you'll land in the stars. Peary's experience is evidence that with determination, preparation, and a bit of luck, you might just hit what you were aiming for.